Ok, boa tarde. Bem-vindos ao Teatro Maria Matos. I would like to very welcome Judith. I'm very happy that you have made it to Lisbon. Bem-vindo também Nuno e Salome. O meu nome é Judith Butler, sou diretor do Teatro Maria Matos. A Salome é co-curadora deste ciclo, Gender Trouble. Obviamente, I will talk in Portuguese since you understand everything. So she really understands Portuguese. It's really amazing. She reads all the text in Portuguese. Anyway, só umas coisas muito rapidamente. Como sabem, isto é assim um bocado o ponto alto de um ciclo que tem duração de 1 mês e meio, com espetáculos, workshops, conferências, seminários, uma série de eventos. É obviamente o ponto alto, porque todo o ciclo foi construído à volta da obra da Judith Butler, o Gender Trouble, e livros que foram saindo a partir daí, desde 1990, é isso? Sim. Bom, só queria anunciar duas coisas. No próximo fim de semana temos um espetáculo absolutamente maravilhoso de Meta Invertsen, que se chama 69 Positions e tem tudo a ver com este tema. A Meta trabalhou a história do corpo em palco e, sobretudo, do corpo sexualizado em palco ao longo dos últimos 25 anos também. E mistura isso com a sua própria história como artista e coreógrafa. Para além disso, também temos um workshop para o qual ainda há alguns lugares, que é um workshop de Aquelarre Cyborg, que é uma organização de Barcelona, e que é um workshop que tem como título The Body as a Sound Post-Gender Instrument. Queria só rapidamente ainda mencionar que lá fora temos uma livraria, que é a Livraria Marcel, que tem estado aqui conosco durante todo o ciclo. Eles têm livros para ver e para vender também, obviamente. Finalmente, queria agradecer à Fundação para a Ciência e a Tecnologia, que trata do live video streaming. Aliás, queria dizer também a toda a gente que esta conferência continua disponível no site do Teatro Maria Matos depois deste evento. Quem quiser mostrar a outras pessoas ou voltar a ver mais tarde, é perfeitamente possível. Também queria agradecer ao Jornal Público, que é media partner deste ciclo, e finalmente dizer que este ciclo também faz parte de um programa da rede House on Fire. É uma rede europeia da qual o Teatro Maria Matos é fundador e que tem o apoio do programa Cultura da Comunidade Europeia. Bom, passo a palavra a Salomé e depois começamos.
Deixamos aqui o microfone. Bom, é com grande entusiasmo que vos damos as boas-vindas a esta conferência, que é a quinta de um ciclo de vários outros debates, onde estivemos a debater performance de género, performatividade e política. Trabalhamos várias coisas, debatemos várias coisas, desde a história da arte ao pós-colonialismo, falamos de antropoceno e hoje é sem dúvida o culminar deste ciclo. Eu queria aproveitar a oportunidade, porque ainda não a tive, de saudar o teatro, porque esta é uma iniciativa do teatro. Foi o Marco e a Andreia Cunha que me contactaram a dizer faz 25 anos que o livro foi lançado, foi publicado, vamos fazer algo em torno deste livro, uma programação vasta e, portanto, porque normalmente acham que fui eu que propus ao teatro e há que deixar bem claro, porque isto é uma coisa rara, é uma coisa especial, é uma coisa de deixar bem claro que é uma iniciativa de um teatro municipal trabalhar estas questões e, portanto, aproveito a oportunidade também para isso. Queria agradecer ao Nuno Carneiro, que é pós-doutorando em Psicologia Crítica em questões LGBT, por ter aceito fazer a moderação de hoje e, of course, a special thanks to Judith Butler e para vocês todos. Já ia falar em inglês. E é tudo. Boa conferência.
Queria só anunciar mais uma coisa, é que temos agora, obviamente, a conferência da Judith e a seguir há espaço para perguntas e respostas da sala E a seguir há uma sessão em que o Judith se disponibilizou para assinar livros, quem quiser.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, of course I'll be very, very short because no one wants to listen to me, and well, welcome everybody, of course, to this conference named Why Bodies Matter. And first of all, I would like to thank the kind and very, very prestigious invitation to moderate the conference. In fact, Judith Butler needs no presentation, but I will read a short biographical note she sent to us, okay? Judith Butler is Maxine Elliott Professor of Comparative Literature and Critical Theory at the University of California at Berkeley. She is the author of several books, including Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, Bodies That Matter, Undoing Gender, and Precarious Life. She is well known as a feminist, queer, and gender theorist who also published in the fields of nonviolence, ethical philosophy, and radical democratic politics. Like Mark said, after Judith's presentation, we'll have 30 minutes to collect questions from the audience. And please, because we are in a theater, and so we have strong lights, and please put your hands in the air, okay? Otherwise we can't know how many people are to make the questions. And so, Judith, I know that all of us, we must thank you so much for being our Judith Butler, okay, for having Traveler, and of course it was nice, Judith Butler. And the theater is now yours.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm most honored and pleased to be here today at the Teatro Maria Matos. And I thank you for celebrating the anniversary of Gender Trouble, the 25th anniversary, with all of these very interesting performances and conferences. I'm particularly grateful to my generous hosts who made it possible for me to come here quite easily. Now, I am, of course, the author of that book, but I have changed in the last 25 years, and the book has taken on a life of its own. I certainly do not disavow the book. I continue to take pleasure in it and to defend it when it gets in trouble, as it sometimes does. It was written at the same time as many other important books and helped to instigate queer theory at the time. That wasn't my intention. I was surprised by the outcome, so from the start, this book that I made was doing something on its own, producing effects without me, and yet I am somehow still its author. I love this, right? People have told me that the book changed their lives, or that they found it exhilarating, or that it was just too difficult to read and they could not finish. And some of those who found it too difficult said that they kept on reading anyway, and then finally, over time, it made sense to them. I did not intend for the book to be so difficult. I didn't think the book would be read at all. So I should start with that apology. At the same time, I continue to think that if we only stay with thoughts that are already familiar to us, none of us would change, none of us would have the chance to regard the world we live in through another lens. I hope it's true that for those of you who read this book and who were perhaps changed by it, that they came to question that you came to question taken for granted assumptions about what gender is and how to think about sexuality. I tried to make room for the complexity of what we are, mainly because I think that life is more livable when we are not confined to categories that do not work for us, or categories that are imposed on us and take away our freedom. The task of feminism, the task of queer theory and activism, the task of trans theory and activism is surely to make it easier to breathe, easier to move down the street without harassment, easier to find a livable life, a life we can affirm with pleasure and joy, where our sense of a livable future is stronger than our experience of suffering. In the 25 years since I wrote Gender Trouble, I've had to encounter many critical questions, of course, even from those who work very closely with me. Sometimes my closest people are my harshest critics, as you can imagine. To this day, many people worry that Gender Trouble established sex as culturally constructed, and so refused or even repudiated the materiality of the body. I mean, I have dreams where people say this to me. How do we answer this criticism? First, it is necessary to consider that to say that a body is constructed is not to say that it's fully constructed, or that it is nothing but a construction. We have to understand in what sense and to what extent a body is shaped and endowed with significance by virtue of the historical framework in which it is understood and the historical discourses through which it is formed. So how do we think about the materiality of the body? Of course, we know that when we seek to understand the materiality of sex, there are various ways of doing so. Some people refer simply to what are called primary sexual characteristics. Others claim that sex characterizes both anatomical parts and something more elusive, even essential, about who a person is. Others insist that sex is a complex composite of anatomy, hormones, chromosomes, and yet others tend to think that all these scientific dimensions of sex are gathered together and defined by different reproductive functions. So you're female if you have that reproductive function, you're male if you have that reproductive function, and that which sex you are can be established by virtue of your relative place in heterosexual reproductive life. So for such a position, which is obviously not my own, the reproductive functions of men make sense of all those different elements, and the same for women. Now, as you know, some people base their views on the materiality of sex on religious doctrine. Others seek recourse to science. And as you probably know, religions do not always hold the same views. Even people within the same religion do not hold the same views. And of course, scientists are also involved in disputing their paradigms. They have conflicting paradigms. So we can't find absolute consensus among scientists on this issue either. So I would suggest that there are two major challenges to this way of thinking that assumes that the materiality of sex is linked to reproductive function. First of all, not all sexed bodies are reproductive, which is to say that some people are not yet of an age where reproduction is possible. Some people are past the age when reproduction is possible. Some people were never capable of reproduction, and others never wanted to reproduce and have led lives without reproducing and are very happy. Are we to say that that whole population of everyone I just named is not sexed? Given this multiplicity of embodied positions in relation to the cultural mandate of reproduction, can we say that it's necessary, even ethically obligatory, to conceive of the sexed body outside the framework of reproduction? After all, sexual reproduction is only one way of organizing and understanding the sexuality of the body. If reproduction becomes the only framework within which we think the sexed body and its materiality, defining all its possible constituent elements in light of their possible or actual reproductive function, then what have we done? We have ruled out the possibility of a sexed body and a sexual life that has no relationship to reproduction. And if we enlarge the paradigm of sexuality within which we think the sexed body, does that sexed body appear differently? In other words, which organs are now sexed? And how do we think of both sexuality and the sexed body outside the framework in which its very materiality is conceptually constrained by the reproductive function? And what are we talking about when we say its very materiality is conceptually constrained by the reproductive function? We're saying its matter is defined by what matters about it. We have only to look to the history of science to see that the very definitions of sex have changed throughout the centuries, and that even now historians of science have spirited arguments about how to identify sex-determining genes, to what extent the genes are determinative of sex, whether they're only determinative in interaction with other kinds of physiological or hormonal elements. International athletic associations argue about testosterone levels that establish someone as capable of competing in women's sports, and they have big debates. And we can think about the case of Caster Semenya from a few years ago. Those hormonal levels vary quite significantly among women. Sometimes they raise the question of whether someone identified socially as a woman can compete in women's sports. There are chromosomal variations as well that affect up to 10% of the population, so that's hardly a clear criterion for sex determination. We surely do say, or at least most of us say, that there are material differences between the sexes, but at the moment in which we talk like that, we're always implicitly referring to one historical version of materialism or another. In other words, we do not deny the generality of those material differences, even though, given the variations and exceptions and the importance of intersex, it would be a mistake, even a form of cruelty, to call that difference between the sexes universal. Even at this most obvious moment, the one in which we declare the reality and materiality of two sexes and everybody feels much better, right, because we've just made it obvious, we're already in a discursive field disputing what we mean and which meaning ought to prevail, because we could all agree that there are two sexes and those differences are material, and we could end the conversation there. But the minute I start to ask you, and by the way, where do you locate that materiality? How do you describe it? The minute we start that, we tend to be not on common ground. Maybe some common ground, maybe not. Actually, what we are in those moments, we're in history. In other words, we're working with historical discourses that are available to us and seem very obvious. Finally, I think that the empirical sciences that seek to establish the body as a discrete empirical phenomenon, one that can be studied as an isolated entity, sometimes fail to understand the body as a living being, or to distinguish adequately between ways of living, even ways of dying. If the body, and if a body is living, as I suggest, it's living in some way, already embedded in cultural relations, in historical discourses. Indeed, can we know the life of the body without understanding in what way it's living? If the body is only treated as a positive and discrete entity, measurable, verifiable, we can gain certainty about its existence. We can even do a medical diagnosis if we're trained to do that. But what we've done with the body is reduced it to a materiality that conforms with a positivist way of seeing. Have we, at that moment, lost sight of the relationships in which the body exists, which allow the body to exist, the relations without which no body can exist? What if the body is a dynamic field of relations, always dependent and interdependent? What if the body is aging, living, falling in love, falling ill, dying or dead? What if it's recovering or flourishing? Does it matter which modality that living being is in when we talk about the life of the body? How do we understand that temporal dimension of embodied life if we remain restricted by the positivist account of the body as a material fact? It's true that we name the body differently depending what discourse we use, depending what language we speak, what purpose we want that body to serve, or what social significance it may have. And indeed, reproductive functions are part of the dominant ways in which we order bodies, at least in relationship to sex. Perhaps what we call the body's materiality is what constantly escapes whatever name we might give it. There is no one name for the body, so whatever the body is, it is never captured by any particular name. Is it there, elusive, persistent, and yet finally what may be most uncapturable by discourse? This is not a way of denying that the body exists. On the contrary, it's a way of saying that no matter how adamant we are in our claims to know and seize and verify and produce the material body, we are bound up in a discourse that cannot claim to be the only way to understand what a body is, what a sexed body is, and how it means. Bodies live on, sometimes as a living being, sometimes not, and we seek to give a name to that which can never be fully or finally named. The body perhaps is the name for our conceptual humility, the limit of our conceptual schemes. Perhaps it is the site of our linguistic failing. Oh, why do we concern ourselves with such theoretical questions? What brought you out of the beautiful sunny day into this dark cavern to listen to this? One reason is that we are concerned with how women, gender nonconforming people, sexual minorities who hurt no one, are regularly misrecognized or unrecognized. When one lives as a body that suffers misrecognition, perhaps insult or harassment, cultural prejudice, economic discrimination, police violence, or psychiatric pathologization, that leads to a derealized way of living in the world, a way of living in the shadows, not as a human subject, but as a phantasm, someone else's phantasm, but you're living it. And yet we see that through social movements that seek recognition and enfranchisement, communities of LGBTQI people have emerged from the shadows, making visible and audible their lives, lives that have the same rights as any other to love and lose, to celebrate and to mourn. Of course, we seek recognition in this world in order to exist as social subjects participating in a common world. At the same time, we know that there is no perfect recognition in this world. That does not mean that we stop struggling for recognition, but only that we must understand that recognition is precisely an ongoing struggle. We ask for recognition not only for who we are, but for our very capacity for self-determination, our claim to equality and to freedom. How do bodies that have been living in the shadow zones emerge into a brighter light? Maybe not full illumination, but still a brighter light. They do this, I would suggest, in solidarity with one another, not as heroic individuals. But still, if we live in a world in which bodies are only understood within conventional norms of gender, or when those who are excluded from society are understood as the non-civilized, then how do such lives become visible and audible under such conditions? How can bodies be recognized when they do not fit the social norm of what bodies should be? What acts of agency are necessary to counter the forces of exclusion and derealization, but also violence? How do bodies gather together to signify their common existence, their intelligibility, and their persistence? Sometimes it's in the very act of standing forth, of walking together, of gathering, that asserts a social existence, signifies a political demand, and promises a different political future. Although much of my own thinking has been concerned with feminism, gender politics, and sexual rights, I think it is important to see how the question of who can be recognized extends to many populations. Indeed, it extends to ever greater numbers of people who now live precarious lives. Such questions come alive when precarious populations gather to protest austerity measures, to protest unjust and racist immigration laws, to protest the increasing conditions of temporary and dispensable labor and exploitation, the profound sense of there being no future, the burden of unpayable debt, the fear of authoritarian regimes, social and police violence. People assemble together not only to voice their opposition to policies that make their lives unlivable, but also sometimes simply and emphatically to stand together in public, more illuminated than before, to draw attention to those specific bodily lives that suffer when shelter is not available, when food sources are unequally distributed, and when basic sustenance and health care is not accessible and not affordable. They do time and again stand together when their very presence on the street sends a certain shockwave through society, as if to say, we, the invisible ones, we exist. This happens in several countries, most countries, when people stand and move in public who are transgendered, queer women, who are undocumented citizens, members of unprotected religious minorities, racial minorities, the precarious. Although there's always a risk of being harassed or hurt or killed when they assemble, as we have seen in many of the major demonstrations in Europe, in Turkey, in Russia, and recently in Iguala, Mexico. I am mindful particularly of those 43 students from Ayotzinapa in Mexico who have disappeared, who are presumed dead, all because, what did they do again? They assembled to protest austerity measures at their university, and they sought to commemorate those who stood bravely before them, protesting austerity measures, and were killed, and they were killed for that. So when we think about those students, to mourn their loss and to demand justice in their name, we are aware, I believe, that they were disappeared. Why? Because they assembled, because they invoked and exercised in a bodily way the right of association, the right to assembly, the right to speak their views. In English, we say they put their bodies on the line. They exercised the most basic rights of democracy, and yet they were treated as criminals, enemies of the state. Those losses deserve to be recognized, and the circumstances of their disappearance need to be publicly known. We can probably all agree on that. But why is this? Well, because they were lives that mattered and matter still, and they deserve to live those lives, and now they deserve to be mourned. I began my remarks this evening by suggesting that the debates about how to understand the body and how to understand the category of sex very often challenge our ideas of common sense. They contest our ideas of the body that has been shaped by the dominant norms of society. I suggested that it can be difficult to revise our ideas about what is natural and what is necessary when we think about gender and sexuality. I suggested as well that these theoretical debates become important when so many people who live outside the norm or in precarious situations struggle for recognition and support for their very lives. Indeed, I have spoken about at least 3 different groups, though they are sometimes overlapping: women, gender and sexual minorities, precarious populations, as well as those who gather openly to exercise their democratic rights, even when that means taking the risk that they will suffer violence and that they will die. So on one level, we're asking about the implicit idea of the body at work in certain kinds of political demands and mobilizations. At another level, we're trying to find out how mobilizations presuppose a body that requires support, popular and political support, but also infrastructural support, including economic and media support. In many of the public assemblies that draw people who understand themselves to be in precarious positions, they are asking for the food they need, the shelter they require, the ongoing employment that would make their life livable, the cultural, social, or political recognition that would allow them to participate in a common public world. These bodies, in showing their precarity, are also resisting the very powers that seek to minimize their powers and to minimize their participation in public life. Of course, if we make the matter individual, we can say that every single body has a certain right to food, shelter, freedom to move and breathe, protected from violence. Although we universalize in such a statement, every body has this right, we also particularize understanding the body as this body, as an individual matter, and that individual body is significantly shaped by a norm of what the body is and how it ought to be conceptualized. Of course, that seems quite obviously right, but consider that this idea of the individual body, a bodily subject of rights, it may fail to capture the sense of vulnerability, exposure, even dependency that's presupposed by the right itself, and which corresponds, I want to suggest, with an alternative view of the body that I suggested earlier, a relational view, a view of the body as living and relational. In other words, if we accept that part of what a body is, and this is for me an ontological claim, part of what a body is its dependency on other bodies and networks of support, then we're suggesting that it's not altogether right to conceive of individual bodies as completely distinct from one another. Of course, neither are they blended into some amorphous social body, but if we cannot readily conceptualize the political meaning of the human body without understanding those relations in which it lives and thrives, we fail to make the best possible case for the various political ends we seek to achieve. So what I'm suggesting is that it is not just that this or that body is bound up in a network of relations, but that the body, despite its clear boundaries, or perhaps precisely by virtue of those boundaries, is defined by the relations that make its own life and action possible, right? We think about the boundary of the body. We might understand it to contain us. This is the boundary of my body. You know, don't smoke near me, or don't stand near me, or whatever it is we do when we privatize our body as a contained kind of element. But actually, the boundary of the body is also the skin that exposes us to touch. It exposes us to visibility, to audibility. It articulates us as a social creature, not just as an individual. Well, what difference does it make if we understand the body in the terms that I propose? Well, I want to suggest that if we understand bodies as defined, for instance, by their sociality, their interdependency, that means that this body This one cannot really exist without another body, without another world of bodies. The I, this I requires a you in order to survive and even to flourish. We are bound to one another socially in important ways. I cannot live without living together with some set of people. And the most individual struggles with survival are always also social struggles. What kind of infrastructure, what kind of services are available? For what kind of world is it in which disenfranchisement is accepted as a necessary way of life? I want to suggest that we cannot let such ordinary ways of thinking limit our own political imaginations. So let me say a few words on how my work on gender performativity has led to my most recent work on precarity. Was precarity always there in gender trouble, or did I take a new turn? Butler took a new turn. I want to say yes to both of those questions. To say that gender is performative is to say that it is a certain kind of enactment. The appearance of gender is often mistaken as a sign of its internal or inherent truth. Gender is prompted by obligatory norms that we materialize in our daily life, or we fail to materialize in our daily life, or we materialize in ways that we weren't exactly supposed to do. But those obligatory norms demand that we become one gender or another, usually within a strictly binary frame. The reproduction of gender is thus always a negotiation with this norm, this obligation, this exercise of power. There is no gender without the reproduction of norms that risks undoing or redoing the norm in unexpected ways, opening up the possibility of a remaking of gendered reality along new lines. The political aspiration of this analysis is found in the call to let the lives of gender and sexual minorities become more possible and more livable for bodies who are gender non-conforming, as well as those who conform too well and at a high cost, to be able, as I have said, to breathe and move more freely in public and private spaces, as well as all the sites that cross those two. The theory of gender performativity never prescribed which gender performances were right. It never said which performances would be more subversive than other performances, and it never said which gender performances were wrong and reactionary. In fact, it's an amoral theory. Okay, gender performativity is an amoral theory. The point, not immoral, okay, amoral. The point was precisely to relax the coercive hold of norms on gendered life, which is not the same as transcending all those norms, for the purposes of living a more livable life. I want to suggest to you that precarity has always been in this picture, since gender performativity was a theory and a practice that opposed the unlivable conditions in which gender minorities live, and sometimes also those gender majorities who passed as normative at a very high psychic and somatic cost. Precarity designates that politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support more than others, and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. Precarity is the differential distribution of precariousness. Populations that are differentially exposed suffer heightened risk of disease, poverty, starvation, displacement, and vulnerability to violence without adequate protection or redress. Precarity also characterizes that politically induced condition of maximized vulnerability and exposure for populations exposed to arbitrary state violence, to street or domestic violence, or other forms not enacted by states, but which the judicial instruments of states fail to provide sufficient protection or redress for. So by precarity, we may be talking about populations who lack sufficient food, or whose food sources arrive one day but not the next, or are carefully rationed. Or we may be talking about populations where housing is suddenly lost or utterly lost. We witness now the important anti-eviction movement in Spain. Let it spread. We might also be talking about transgendered sex workers who have to defend themselves against street violence and police harassment, or we might be talking about the gay, lesbian, queer people in Moscow who were just recently beaten up quite brutally by the police for doing what? For assembling and trying to celebrate gay pride. Sometimes these are the same groups, sometimes they're overlapping. But when they are part of the same population, they can be linked by their sudden or protracted subjection to precarity and their resolve to resist that condition. And the question for us, and maybe the question for a radical democratic left, is how can they be linked? How can these various populations be linked over time? What brings them together? What allows them to arrive together, to assemble together? In this way, I want to suggest that precarity is directly linked with gender norms, since we know that those who do not live their genders in intelligible ways are at heightened risk for harassment, pathologization, and violence. Gender norms have everything to do with how and in what way we can appear in public space, how and in what way the public and the private are distinguished, and how that distinction is instrumentalized in the service of sexual politics. Who will be criminalized on the basis of their public appearance? By which I mean who will be treated as a criminal and produced as a criminal, which is not always the same as being named criminal by a code of law that discriminates against manifestations of certain gender norms or certain sexual practices. So criminalization can happen both in codified ways within law, but also in non-juridical ways that can have equally violent effects. Who will fail to be protected by the law, or more specifically, the police, on the street or on the job or in the home, in legal codes or religious institutions? Who will be stigmatized and disenfranchised at the same time that they become the object of fascination and consumer pleasure? Who will have medical benefits before the law? Whose intimate and kinship relations will be recognized before the law or criminalized by the law, or indeed may shift quite radically depending on which legal code is in operation, religious or secular, or whether or not the tension between legal codes happens to be resolved. The question of recognition is for me an important one, for if we say that we believe all human subjects deserve equal recognition, we presume that all human subjects are equally recognizable. But what if the field of appearance does not admit everyone? What is that? How is it that that field is regulated in such a way that only certain kinds of beings can appear as recognizable subjects and others not? This is surely one question posed by the animal rights movements, since why is it that only human subjects are recognized rather than non-human living beings? That question is linked with and confounded by another, namely, which humans count as the human? Which humans are eligible for recognition within the sphere of appearance, which are not? And what do we call those who do not and cannot appear as subjects within hegemonic discourse? We know this question in one way from the theory of gender. There are sexual and gender norms that condition what and who will be legible and what and who will not, and that expose those who fail to register within intelligibility to differential forms of social violence. So in order to understand those forms of living gender in its full complexity, we have to understand the ways in which gender is misrecognized or remains unrecognized, precisely because those who live on the margins or in non-conforming ways are testing the limits of established norms for thinking embodiment and even personhood. Are there forms of sexuality for which there is no good vocabulary, precisely because the powerful logics that determine how we think about desire, orientation, sexual acts, and pleasures do not admit of certain modes of sexual pleasure, practice, or orientation? The performativity of gender is bound up with the differential ways in which subjects become eligible for recognition. Recognition depends fundamentally on whether there is a media, a form of presentation in which the body can appear This is another reason why the aesthetic domain and the theatrical domain is so important for contesting the arbitrary limits that are imposed on the field of appearance. Even though something called full recognition is a fantasy, and one that locks us into a certain phantasm of who we might be or should be, certain ways of being deprived of recognition surely also threaten the very possibility of persisting. To be a subject at all requires first finding one's way with certain norms that govern recognitions, norms we never chose. And so, if we cannot find our way within available norms of gender or sexuality, or we only find our way with great difficulty, we are exposed to what it means to live at the limits of recognizability. To exist at such a limit means that the very legibility, the very viability of one's life is called into question, what we might call the social ontology of our persistence. In some standard liberal discourses, subjects are thought to be those kinds of beings who come before an existing law and ask for recognition within its terms. But we have to ask a prior question: what makes it possible to even come before the law, to appear before the law, to have the status of one who can appear before the law? Kafka asked this question, by the way, in some rather good formulations. One has to have access or status. One has to be able to enter into a space to appear in some form. And here we can think about the situation of undocumented workers, or those whose status is criminalized from the start, but who require both rights and obligations, protections and the powers of citizenship. So what is at stake when we seek to understand performative politics in its struggle from and against precarity? As we know, not everyone can take for granted the power to walk on the street or into a bar or even a restaurant. To walk on the street alone without police harassment is precisely not to walk with the company of others and whatever non-police forms of protection that supplies. And yet when a transgendered person walks on the street in Ankara or in McDonald's in Baltimore, there's a question of whether that right can be exercised by the individual walking in alone. If the person is extraordinarily good at self-defense, perhaps it can. If it is in a cultural space where that is accepted, it surely can. But if and when it does become possible to walk unprotected and still be safe, for daily life itself to become possible without fear of violence, then it's surely because there are many who support that right, even when it is exercised by one person alone. So I may exercise it, but I can only exercise it effectively if I have the support of many. If the right is exercised and honored, it is because there are many there, even if they are not there, exercising it as well, whether or not anyone else is on the scene. Each I necessary in order to live and to live well. Our shared exposure to precarity is but one ground of our potential equality and of our reciprocal obligations to produce together conditions of livable life. In avowing this need we have for one another, we avow as well basic principles that inform the social democratic conditions of a livable life. These are critical conditions for democratic life in the sense that they are part of an ongoing crisis, critical in the sense of relating to a crisis, but also because they belong to a form of thinking and acting that responds to the urgencies of our time. I guess my final suggestion is this: let us continue to be responsive, even when it seems we may become overwhelmed, even when it seems that there is no hope. For in responding to what we see, responding to what happens to others, responding to the conditions in which precarity becomes more and more the norm, we stand the chance to remain animated creatures, animated and thinking with desire, hope, rage, and sorrow. We keep the senses alive, and so we live on as the embodied lives that we are and that we deserve to be. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, can you please turn on the lights, because it's really difficult to see people from here, okay?
Even it out a little here.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so from now on you can ask your questions, please. Put your hands in the hand, please.
Anybody have some questions?
Let's see. Okay.
It's a gentleman.
I just want to collect 3 or 4 questions, okay? No, sorry, I want to collect, okay?
Oh, you want to collect them written?
Yes.
In written form?
No, it's not necessary to read. Okay.
But did you
It's
not
just
call
to
him?
have 3 or 4
Oh, okay.
questions, okay?
But I'm just asking what
for-
your sequence
okay.
is.
Okay.
Did you call on him or
The
not?
first person?
He's the first
okay.
person.
Yeah.
Okay.
The first person is there, and?
Judith Butler, how could you define, please, I know that it is a difficult question, radical democracy?
Okay, yes.
Another person, please. Oh, okay. Yes.
Thank you. How do you think or feel that bodies in assembly can reconfigure or disturb what is accepted or considered the sphere of appearance?
The sphere of
Appearance.
Next, please.
Two questions from people watching us online. The first one is, why gender trouble? Why not gender problem or gender issue? The second one is, how to fight the norm in this binary world. We need tools.
Do we not run the risk that bodies might, do we not run the risk that bodies might end up feeling contented, satisfied by what we have? Imagine if we were to fight austerity and so on. Do we not run the political risk of running into a plateau where bodies feel satisfied enough?
It was clear for you, Judith. It was clear for you.
Kind of.
Okay. And please, finally, João, and then if you want to, okay, Judith. Please, 4 or 5.
In relation to the idea of the network that built the bodies, and in relation to the risk of the segmentations of the alternatives in order, for the market, I don't know, like targets, is it this network? Could we say that it's something we could we universalize this network in some ways? Is this the task? Oh.
Can I have another one and finish? This first. Okay. So please, João asked it first. Okay. Sorry. And then we start. And João is here. Yes. With it. Yes, with the blue shirt.
Well, thank you so much for your conference. It's
Well,
fundamental for us in gender studies to have you here, and we are very happy to have you here. I would just like to ask you if you have any thoughts about the ideas around necropolitics and the relationship of necropolitics with the type of austerity measures we are suffering in Southern Europe and in other places. Thank you.
So, okay.
Okay, so let's try to take this. Let's try to take this on.
Thank you, Judith Butler.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me. I don't know if this is supposed to be up like this.
If you want to use mine.
No, it's okay. It's all right. Well, let me talk a little bit about radical democracy. My colleague, my friend Ernesto Laclau, of course, died this last year, and I was just at a conference in Paris where many people were trying to think through the meaning and future of radical democracy in the wake of his death. And although I had some interesting and wonderful disagreements with him, I think I do agree with him that radical democracy requires that we think about fundamental democratic principles such as equality and justice and freedom as open-ended concepts that are that have been established, and they must remain open-ended precisely because they have been established on false grounds, that is to say, on grounds that are exclusionary. Equality for whom? Freedom for whom? The Constitution of my country asserted certain liberal political principles for white men who owned property, and claimed that they were that all the rights in the Constitution were universal, right? So we can see how the problem of universality has been implicated in radical exclusion and anti-democratic structural investments. So radical democracy, it seems to me, has to be willing to question the framework within which we accept settled ideas of what equality, justice, and freedom may be. So when people started claiming that they were mobilizing for gender freedom, There were others who said, well, that's not really a domain of freedom. Even Hannah Arendt would say that's not a domain of freedom. Right? Gender is a fact, it's given. Gender is a historical situation that is, or a biological situation, or something that's given. It's not made, it's not an exercise of freedom. But so when people came forth to say, no, this is an exercise of freedom, that meant we had to rethink our concept of freedom. Our concept of freedom had excluded the possibility of conceptualizing gender freedom. Now, you could come back and say, well, that's too much, or that's the wrong kind of freedom, or I don't agree with everyone who lays claim to freedom in that way. And then we have a dispute. We have a hegemonic debate about, you know, which view is better, which view is right, which view ought to hold. I sat next to a French politician once, kind of against my will, and he said to me that, well, gay, lesbian parenting, that's okay. I don't see why they can't be parents just because they're gay or lesbian. But he didn't think that prostitution should be understood as choice. And he didn't think that surrogate motherhood should be accepted because that puts that puts the womb into market relations, right? So he was willing, and I'm not going to take a big stand on these things, although I am in favor of the enfranchisement of sex workers, and I do think they choose under the conditions that they choose. Okay, but here's the thing. I do think that that when these kinds of issues emerge, right, it's not just, okay, shall we extend our given idea of freedom to this new claim, this new movement, this new mobilization, and if we do extend it, whoever we are, do we have to rethink what we mean by freedom? In other words, has our idea of freedom excluded, by definition, certain populations that are coming back and actually demanding a rearticulation of the concept? So I am, in general, in favor of a notion of radical democracy that also would involve the radical reorganization of the economy, and would prioritize social democratic rights and obligations in a way over and against privatization and the decimation of such possibilities under neoliberal regimes. Similarly, if I can just move to the necropolitics question, I think that Achille Mbembe is clearly right to have us supplement our idea of Foucault's concept of biopolitics with an idea of necropolitics. Because for Foucault, of course, biopolitics focused on the management of populations, and he was more interested in how populations were divided up and how they were contained, or how their interests were separated from one another, or how bureaucratic control or administrative power operates to discipline subjects in certain kinds of ways. Of course, Foucault did talk about those biopolitical policies that let people die, right? It was a very important formation that let people die. So they didn't actively kill them, but they let them die. And I believe that what Mbembe has done is actually taken this moment of Foucault and read it through, say, Fanon, read it through post-colonial theory, in order to think about how the management of populations is also about preparing certain populations to die, or letting certain populations die en masse. So we see that, for instance, in the treatment of disease, but we see it, of course, most flagrantly in the boatloads of hopeful immigrants who are left to die in the Mediterranean. Odd that the European governments and the EU would let that happen, given that there's all that expensive property along the coast. No, where are those bodies going to wash up, right? Like right in the middle of the most expensive resorts. Okay, sorry, that's just my little fantasy, I guess. But, you know, I mean, I think we can see more and more, especially in the margins of the metropole and on the borders of almost every European country at this point, populations that are amassed that have no citizenship, that have no future, that are not being allowed to go one way or another and are not being provided for. I think more broadly, this is an example of the necropolitical extension of Foucault's theory. I think austerity measures, I mean, I think we have to think about austerity measures as producing populations with unpayable debt, producing populations who can no longer live in their own homes. I mean, there's a kind of slow and steady expulsion into indebted homelessness. And I think that happens both in the peripheries of Europe for sure, and it also happens on the borders. We also see, I mean, we could track this, I think, globally in many complex ways that I'm not able to do right here tonight. I don't know whether I would universalize the idea of the network, although there are network theorists who would do that, and that's an interesting way to go. I do think the network as a concept allows us to think about bodily assemblies, but also virtual networks and solidarities that cross virtual and embodied space. I think it's an important concept. I'm not sure I would universalize it. I do think that we have to be careful about how the internet works, both to connect us and to segment us. And of course, we also have to think about market relations in relationship to networking, which is, of course, a concept that's very important for corporate logics. I have a feeling that that question comes from some other places I would have to learn more about. Whether bodies feel satisfied enough, I find it really interesting that someone could ask that question. I mean, it's interesting to go from necropolitics, the necropolitics question, to whether we're too satisfied. And I kind of think that maybe in Portugal you're in this odd place because you're in the EU and you're better off than a lot of places, but you're also the subjugated periphery and you see what's coming. So I don't know. How I'm just symptomatically, it's like, oh, I got both questions in Portugal. Ooh. What about satisfaction? Let's think about satisfaction. I don't really care so much about satisfaction. It's interesting as a concept. It's not something that that I think about or theorize or call for. Like we deserve satisfaction. I use a different language, which is more about surviving and flourishing or persisting. And I think maybe there's a little Spinoza in my thinking, but I hate to say that because I know the Deleuzians will come in. But I read Spinoza before Deleuze, so just, you know, the ethics, okay, Spinoza's ethics. So here we go. But I think maybe ongoing desire, right? I think the desire to desire, maybe the Lacanian idea is a good one here, what do we need? Do we need the satisfaction of desire? Do we need our bodies to be satisfied? Do we need consumer satisfaction? I don't think so. I think we need a certain sense of support and future for desire, that we might be creatures who can continue to desire, whose desire to desire has not yet been destroyed. How do we fight the binary norm? Well, I think we start with the idea that there are vast numbers of people who live outside the binary norm already. In other words, it's just a question of linking those people and getting them together in some pretty well-organized ways. And it pains me that sometimes I see feminists who struggle against the trans movement, or I see trans or gay, lesbian people who are struggling against feminism, or groups from any of these who are not yet connected with other people who are living outside of normative gender, but who are primarily dealing with poverty, or primarily dealing with literacy or mobility or basic rights of citizenship. So the real question is, at what point do we produce agonistic alliances, alliances among those who may not utterly love each other, for the purposes of not only contesting binary gender, which does do violence to so many people, but also taking from that critique the idea that there has to be support for greater embodied complexity in life, and thinking about the body and how it does suffer from social norms, not just from social norms, but also from the threat of violence. If that became the site of a certain kind of alliance, it seems to me we would be articulating in new ways. So let's not only contest that, but also contest in general the violence that norms can do, or the violence that those who are non-conforming do experience when they are without adequate support, or in hostile cultural and political spaces. How bodies in assembly can reconfigure the sphere of appearance. Well, it's funny, some of these figures became queer by virtue of being in the line. In other words, I mean, I love it that Barbra Streisand's there. I don't have any problem with that. And why not? She is campy, right? She is super campy. But when you finally have her there, kind of subtly at the end of a row that includes, I don't know, any number of flaming figures, there's something new that happens there. It's a different kind of juxtaposition, and it reconfigures our idea of how she seems. She could be normative gender, right? We could see her in Glamour magazine. We could see her as, see, that's normative gender, we could say. But maybe not. Maybe there's something in the normative that bespeaks its non-normativity, and that assembling it in certain ways actually brings out that tension. So it's not just how pastiche works or how counterpoint works in Godard, but even in public assemblies, you sometimes get a kind of sense of who the people are that is not the sense that you usually have of what the people are. And I do think that it's in public assemblies that visual and audible and tactile ways of reconfiguring who the people are do take place. I mean, if one enters the sphere of appearance within a regulated structure, and I think we do have to agree with Jacques Rancière that the sphere of appearance is regulated. Certain things can appear and certain things cannot. I mean, he makes an even stronger claim that politics, which would be the eruption of the people, is precisely what cannot appear in the regulated sphere of appearance, right? I think his view is maybe too romantic for me, but what I do accept is that there is the sphere of appearance, which Hannah Arendt gives us, is regulated, which she wouldn't have liked, and that it gets deregulated or opened up in certain ways when dominant imagery starts emerging that that does call into question the repressive and exclusionary frameworks within which we understand who the people are, and it's quite the problem. Like, are the hopeful migrants at the on the border, are they the people? Are they the people? Yes, no. Are they the limit of the people? Is that where the sphere of visibility ends? Or if we do get the image, is it periodic, sensational, in some way, or is it part of the complexity of who the people are? So I do think, even though assemblies, demonstrations are transient, and they are transient, something happens within them that is recurrent, which is that the question of who the people are gets opened up again and again. I'm not saying that I have complete utopian faith in bodies in assembly. I don't. But I do think something does happen there that reopens the question of what is a democracy and what is a people. I guess I think that I did answer the questions.
Are you tired, or?
Well, I'm okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, do we have a little bit more of time to questions? Okay. And, well, you were not quite democratic because there are people up there and outside. I don't know if, okay.
Obrigada. I would like to make a question about the conflict that sometimes exists between feminism and the trans community. I hope this doesn't come off as confusing, but it is a little bit confusing for me, so I'll try to frame this in the best way possible. So we have these two ideas. One idea that gender is a construction, and one idea that a polar opposite idea that gender is not a construction, is an inherited truth, that you are born in a way. How can we conciliate the idea that gender is in fact a construction, but at the same time be supportive of the trans community? How can we frame a discourse theoretically and in practical terms that we can be supportive of the trans community, but at the same time we can't believe that gender doesn't exist?
Oh, well, I thank you for that question, because it's going to help me clarify some things. And I'm aware of this debate in these terms, but for me, to say gender is a construction does not mean it does not exist. It exists. It exists very strongly. It exists very pervasively. And I don't think we can live in a world in which we're suddenly without genders, or at least maybe we can imagine such a world, but given where we are historically, I can't imagine us getting there. And I've never said that what we need is a full nullification of gender. A lot of people really like their genders too. Let's keep that in mind. They're not about to give them up or change them much. Okay. But first of all, so I don't think gender is false or that gender doesn't exist. When we say it's a construction, what do we mean? Well, first of all, it's not chosen in the sense of an existential choice. We're assigned genders. And gender assignment is the first act of gender construction, and it's an act that somebody else performs. I don't perform it. Somebody else performs it, or a whole set of institutions perform it. This is a boy, this is a girl. Forms are filled out. This person is put into the world as a boy, as a girl. Okay, and gender assignment is the first act of gender construction. It is not chosen. It is the unchosen basis of gender construction. Now, many people feel that the assignment is simply wrong, that it's unlivable. And in my view, an unlivable gender assignment has to be changed. So when somebody says to me, this is fundamental to who I am, I must change my gender, they have my support. Now, what does it mean to say it's fundamental to who I am? That's where I am, to some degree, I'm willing to listen to the language people have for explaining their experiences. What I understand it to mean is that here is a sense of who I am that is so deep in me that if I must deny this, life as I know it is unlivable. Now, some people will say, oh, that means it's essential. That means it's true. That means your gender is not constructed. It's like, well, I don't know. How do any of us come to have that firm sense of gender? It's to some degree mysterious to me, but